Jim Stewart. Today we're going to be talking about the basics of surround sound. I've been into the hobby for about 25 years, ever since I saw a ProLogic demo, and it just was blown away. I'd like to introduce you to the audience today.
Hi, I'm Amy.
And Amy, what do you want to know most about surround sound? Or what do you like most about surround sound?
It makes movies seem really cool.
Also in the audience today, we have...
Hi, my name's Rachel.
And what do you want to learn today?
I find surround sound pretty complicated, and I'd like to learn how to hook it up in the easiest way possible.
All right, well, let's begin. So let's start with some basic understanding here. So what is surround sound? So surround sound is essentially, it's the evolution of the soundtrack that goes along with movies. And by evolution, I mean how the sound was mixed. I mean, at first we had silent movies, and then they went to mono. Mono movies being one speaker, and then stereo tracks, a left and right channel, and then additional sort of mixes came in, and it's called mixed matrix. It was kind of a novelty. It wasn't quite discrete channels, but then now what we have is discrete multi-channel recording. So now you have a center channel, right and left channels, and then rear channels as well, which we'll cover in a little bit. So the source material, the movie, once it's recorded, it's got the sound encoded in a format. Now, format can be different types of discrete channels that are mixed together. And some of the big companies that do the mixing on the vast majority of movies that you see are DTS and Dolby. And they have different formats, True HD, they've got 7.1, 5.1, and a whole host of different configurations. When doing surround sound, you have to take into account the effect of the room on sound. Sound bounces off walls and ceilings and all the like. And so when you think about a theoretically perfect configuration, you see these sorts of diagrams where everything is perfectly laid out with no realistic room. But a realistic room is going to be, you're going to have things like a high ceiling, or in this case, you're going to have an area where there's a dead spot due to an open hallway. But an actual perfect room in real life would not be a very comfortable place. It would be like this, just stale, one seat, all kinds of material on the walls to improve the sound and control the reflections. And like I was saying, there's multiple types of configurations of the various encoders. There's 3.1, 5.1, and 7.1, all the way to 11.2. Now, the point represents 10% of the bandwidth is going to the subwoofer, and the subwoofer is what provides the low frequencies, the explosions and all the like. So when you're thinking about setting up a surround sound system, what's best for you is going to be a function of your budget, right? So what I always recommend is start small and build up, and base it on the limits of your room. If you've got a small room, you don't necessarily want to do some 11.2 setup. So when you're setting up surround, you want to take into effect the theoretical sort of perfect configuration, and then lay it out in the realistic version of your room as best you can. So you're going to have a center point where your main seat is relative to your screen, your center channel, your front right and left channels, your side channels, and your back channels. And then of course your subwoofer can be placed pretty much anywhere you want. Low frequencies aren't very directional. And in this case, this shows an actual room sketch. So once you have your theoretical sketch based on the number of channels that you have, you apply it to your actual room In this case, it's kind of an off angle. So typically what you're going to have these days, the good news is most things are connected with an HDMI cable. Now, HDMI cable made hooking up electronics incredibly simple. So you've got your receiver, which I have down here and I'll show later, and your television, and they're connected via an HDMI cable, which couldn't be easier. There's no right or wrong, there's not one side goes the input and one goes the output. It's just click and click. And here's a diagram. The next, in this one, is a little bit more complicated, but this comes into play once you do your room corrections, which also we'll show a little bit later. But your crossover points or your bass management is an important part of setting up your surround sound. If you look here, we have a chart. On this chart, you've got low frequencies, the bass, the explosion, mid-range frequencies, that's sort of the voice, and then high frequencies, things like cymbals and very high-pitched noises. And basically, your subwoofer handles all of the low frequencies. And in between your low and mid, this is a crossover point. So the frequencies that you want to do this crossover at are very important so that you're sending the correct information to your subwoofer. And this is configured inside your receiver, and we'll show exactly how that's done a little bit later. But sometimes there's additional low frequency filtration on the subwoofer itself. So again, when we go over the room corrections, when we do we'll hook up the microphone to our receiver and we'll record some sounds that come out of the receiver, and that it measures reflections, it will correct for things like wood floor. But there's things you can do as well. So if you have a wood floor, a big throw rug is a great thing to do to sort of deaden that first reflection that goes on there. Large glass windows, really good thing to do for that is heavy curtains. Also, very interestingly enough, clutter. So furniture, tables, chairs, big pillows, these sorts of things actually help control the reflections in a room. So the clutter is essentially good for surround sound. And like I said, your receiver is going to have a microphone, which we'll go over. And the last thing that is important to know before we get into exactly how you hook these things up is when you do playback, you want to know exactly what way you want to play it back based on how it was recorded. So in a DVD, if it was recorded, or a Blu-ray, if it was recorded in True HD or 7.1, you want to make sure your receiver is set to the proper encode, or excuse me, the proper decoder based on the encoding of the movie. Now let's get into how to set this stuff up. So today, many receivers come with one of these little microphones. And sometimes they come with a deal that can be set up on a boom, like a camcorder can. And once you've hooked your microphone up to your receiver's microphone input, in this case it's on the front, it'll automatically launch the room correction menus on your receiver. And you'll get a screen probably similar to this. Each receiver is going to have a slightly different one. Now, I've already run the room corrections, so we'll go to the next step because it's a really self-explanatory step once you fire off the room correction. Basically, it'll make noises come out of each of your channels. They're very, very loud. And then you'll have either a manual or an auto setup. And some receivers are going to give you a diagram of how your your speaker layout is set up based on the ability of the microphone to pick up sounds from those channels. And it'll give you crossover points for, like we were talking about before, with the low frequency, the mid, and the highs. In this case, they're at 80 hertz for my rear channels. And a whole bunch of other measurements are made during that. One of them is the distance, and of course the crossover points and levels. And one of the things that you can see, and this isn't necessarily something you need to change, but just to show you the difference based on room correction, what that microphone does. So here we have a chart that shows the front left channel, and you can think of these as a frequency range from low to high, and you can see how gain was either applied, so it either amplified the high, amplified the mid, and decreased gain on the low end, and that was all part of room correction. Now if we look, the front left and the front right have different shapes, and that's because this particular speaker, which is my front right channel, is going to have a different sound path to the place I had set my microphone up, which is the sweet spot on that diagram that we had talked about before. And this path is going to be different from the path that this speaker takes. So this particular speaker has a big open wall on this side, whereas that one has a closed wall. And based on the measurements of the microphone, it decided that these are the appropriate corrections to make in order to get the sound to the place I set my microphone when I did my recording. And center and surround left and surround right and all the like. So now we're going to talk about speaker wire and actually hooking up your channels, which obviously you do before you do your room recording and your room correction. But I wanted to go ahead and show that first to help understand exactly how this stuff really all comes together. So speaker wire, you don't need to spend a fortune on this stuff. I would recommend going with a 16 gauge, and gauge is based on the width or the amount of copper that's in the cable. And when you look at the cable, there's going to be a side marked and a side unmarked. Sometimes it's a smooth side and a sort of rough side, and that's to help you make sure that when you connect it to your receiver and connect it to your speaker, that you have it connected to the right parts, the positive and negative ports on both. So if you look at the back of a speaker, here we have a positive and a negative connection. Here we have, this particular speaker has an amplified subwoofer built in, so it also has a line level. So I've got the red connected to the red and the black connected to the black. And these correspond to the back of the receiver, where we have our right and left main channels hooked up. This particular receiver has 9.4 channels. So I've got 4 subwoofers and 9 channels, and they're all connected to their appropriate location via speaker wire going into banana clips that are then attached to the ports appropriate on the receiver. And here I've got the HDMI cables connected to my sources. In this case, I've got PlayStation and TV and for the output, and LAN connection and all the like. So let's go around the room and look at the speakers that are in this setup. Of course, we have our front speakers that we mentioned before. We have our center channel speaker, which is where all the voice comes out, that mid-range frequencies. In this system, I've also got height channels. They're totally not necessary. They give an effect. They give decent effects for like rain and helicopter noises and stuff, but they're optional. Here we have our side channels. In this case, I'm using floor standing speakers for my side channels, and I have the speaker wire running underneath the carpet all the way to here to hide the speaker wire. And I've got one on either side of the main listening area. And then over here I've got the rear channels. Again, the speaker wire runs all the way underneath the carpet and up to the back of these guys. And with the sides and the rear, this is how you get that enveloping sound that we had when we demoed in the very beginning all of the soundtracks. Lastly, I've got subwoofers. This is where the low frequency sound comes from. In my case, I've got 4, which is totally overkill, but there's one here. I've got one behind this chair here. And then the 2 that are built in to the front, right, and left subwoofer. And with that, you have 9 channels. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the 2 in the back. And then the 0.4 are the 2 subwoofers plus these 2 subwoofers that are built in. 9.4. So now you know how to set up a surround sound system properly. And let's find out if the audience has any questions.
I have a question. So you had mentioned that you run your speaker wire underneath the carpets to hide the speaker wire, but you also talked about some people having wood floors. So what do you suggest people do if they don't have carpet?
That's an excellent question. So one of the things you can do is you can buy it's a channel guide. It's a funny name, but basically it's a double-sided tape with a plastic channel in it that you can cram the speaker wire into, and then that attaches with that adhesive to your baseboards, and then you can run it around the edge of your room. That's one way. Another way of doing it is to go into the wall, run it up into the ceiling, and then drop it down the other side. That is a much more complicated way to do it, but it's the most professional way to do it, in which case you'll end with some speaker plates.
Oh, okay, yeah. Amy, do you have a question?
Where are you supposed to get all of these speakers and stuff? I mean, do you have to go to a specific store, or can you just buy it like HEB or something?
Well, you can get it online, of course, but I don't recommend buying speakers blindly online. You really want to do a listen session. So one of the best places to go is like a Best Buy or a Fry's or a whole host of these big box store electronic distribution places. And what you do there is you demo the speakers that you've got or that you're interested in. You don't necessarily need to buy from them. You can shop around online. So once you've heard them, you like what you hear. They may or may not have the best price, but once you find the speakers you want, that's the best way to start, is decide on the speakers you want, then shop the price for those speakers.
So you said decide on the speakers that you want. What if, your budget doesn't allow you to buy all, a 9.4 system like you have? If you start, maybe you just get a 3.1 or a 5.1, does that make it, is it more difficult to build onto than if you just do everything at the beginning and start?
Wow, that is a fantastic point. I actually recommend starting out small. If you're, from a budget perspective, you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, out of your speakers, because the speaker technology itself actually doesn't change. It's pretty much the same technology that it's always been. Yeah, they get a little bit fancier, a little bit, but not much. A speaker made 10 years ago and a speaker made yesterday are going to be incredibly similar with respect to quality, right? So you can get a cheesy little cheap thing that sounds all crunchy and doesn't give good low frequency or high frequency response. But my perspective is you invest in the speakers, you start out small with only two left and right main channels, then a really good center, there's your third. Maybe you do a subwoofer at that point, and last but not least, add the rears. But by no means do you need to go all out all at once. That's totally unnecessary. If you're looking for a place to sort of cut corners on cost, it's actually better to cut the corners on the receiver. You could go and get a separate amplifier, because like speaker technology, amplifier technology doesn't change very much either. So good amplifiers, good speakers, and then as technology changes, the rapid technology changes are occurring in the receiver, so you can just change out your receiver every few years, and you don't necessarily need to spend a whole lot of money on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, well that concludes how to set up a surround sound system. I hope you learned something today.